The Somali language turns out to be one of the most explored and studied of the languages of the East Africa and the Horn of Africa. And there are so many, we could say, linguists and scholars of different kinds who came to East Africa and the Horn of Africa to try to study the language. And there are books that were written going as far back as 1849. And I'm talking about books written by the Europeans. Of course, there is a high chance that there are other books that were written by other people before then. Could be Arab scholars, could be even Somali scholars themselves who wrote books about the language. Now, in this video, I'm going to look at 7 of the oldest books that are written about the Somali language by European scholars, and I need to clarify that so that we don't get lost because of that fact, which is very important. Now, when you look at these books, there are two main challenges that these linguists were facing when they were trying to, of course, study this language and document how the language was used, its phonetics, its structure, and things like that. And the first challenge, and most of these two main challenges were mostly resolved in the 1970s, and I'm going to of course talk about how those challenges were resolved in the 1970s. Now, the first challenge was the lack of standardization of the language. Now, this is a challenge for all languages, not just the Somali language. Language has this nature of changing to accommodate the immediate environs and use. When people move from one place to another, they of course have to change language a little bit. Sometimes because of new reality, sometimes because of the new people they meet and things like that. So language tends to change, and sometimes when people speak the same language, of course, move to different locations, the way they use the language over time, of course, kind of like changes a little bit, so that when they meet sometime later, they realize that how they are using the language is no longer really the same. So that was the first challenge. The Somali as a people are such a huge society, or is such a huge society covering very big piece of land. You can imagine, and we are talking of 19th century going back. Communication was not like today. Of course, today TV, internet, kind of like can help still keep the language being more or less the same. But before these technologies, languages, especially of people who were covering such a big piece of land, would of course change over time. So there was that challenge of standardized Somali language. How does that, what is the standard Somali language? There were so many dialects, and of course, you get what I mean. That was the first major challenge. And when I was trying to do some research about this, I realized, it became very clear that that was the first challenge that these people were facing. The second challenge, of course, and this is excludes, of course, the fact that these people were not speaking the language itself. They were not native speakers of the language. So that's of course another one. But we are not going to go into that because that's very clear, of course. The second challenge was capturing the unique Somali phonetic sounds. Somali language turns out, I don't speak Somali, but reading through these documents, it becomes very clear that Somali language has very unique sounds that don't exist in other languages. And of course, Somali as a society, like most African societies, were not so huge into writing. They were huge into the oral literature, like poetry and such things. And Somalis were very good at recording things in poetry, in oral literature, keeping records in that. They were so good with poetry and things like that. So there had never been such a big need for trying to find symbols for specific unique sounds of the language. Now, when these people come, the linguists and scholars, they are trying to put that language down. They are faced with that reality that there are unique Somali sounds that don't exist in the languages that had already established a writing system. So that became a huge challenge, such that they were trying to figure out how to capture those sounds. Now, as I said, most of these challenges have been resolved. Today, they are not really an issue. And they were resolved after independence, 1970s. The government then, of Siad Barre in particular, maybe probably he was not the first one to see it as a problem, but it is him who or his government that took it upon themselves to try to resolve those issues. And in the 70s, their language was standardized, and then they came up with a writing system that captures the unique needs of the language, so that today the Somali language is one of the languages in Africa. We could say probably one of the few languages that have their own unique way of doing those things, writing in particular. Now, um, let's go through this list. Now, the first book that was written that was trying to attempt to describe the language was it's more or less an article published in 1849, and it was titled "On the Somali Language." Now, this is an article that was written by one Lieutenant Christopher Palmer Rigby. Now, one thing that is, this guy was an army officer. He was stationed mostly in the coast, but Aden mostly, not really in the coast of Somalia, but Aden, which is an important fact to bear in mind. He never lived in the lands of the Somalis. He didn't even visit really. Seems like he stayed mostly in Aden. That's where he stayed, and whatever information he collected about the language was from the Somali sailors and traders and merchants and people, Somali people who lived in Aden. And I've seen another video that actually Aden at some point used to have a significant population of Somali. Sometimes they formed close to 40-50% of the population at some point. So there was a sizable population of Somali people in Aden. And those are the people he was talking to, trying to understand the language, to record its grammar, and things like that. Basic grammar, really. He didn't go into such, you could say, a lot of detail. He just captured the outline of the grammar of the language. Now, the only reason why this document matters really is not because it's robust or comprehensive or deep, it's simply because it's considered to be the first ever attempt by a European to understand the Somali language and to record what he was getting from that language. That's its importance is up to that. It's not really like it's a very important scholarly work. Not really, not really. Now, the second book that is on my list is on the Somali language. Again, same title. This is a book. This is more or less a document that was published in 1870, and it was written by one Franz Pretorius. Now, this gentleman was a German. He was not a British, because most of the people who wrote about the language were British. But this was a German guy, and he studied many of the Eastern African languages, not just Somali, but many others. Now, also like the first guy, he never lived on the lands of the Somalis, which is an important, of course, I said an important fact. So he never set a foot in the Horn of Africa. And he actually didn't really even come to Africa, to East Africa. That's very interesting. He didn't. He stayed in Germany, and he would interview Somalis he came across in Germany. So whenever he knew there was a Somali around, he would try to get to have a conversations with them, and then to try to understand the language. Most people say, I've looked around the reviews, like he was good at capturing details, really. And the book he created is a textbook really of Somali grammar rules, basically Somali grammar rules. And the book is notable because it is a book that was written by someone who was not really in Africa and captured African languages in a way that we could say maybe was a little bit successful. He was studying language from afar, or these African languages from afar, and he was more or less, we could say, successful. He did try to record the grammar rules of the Somali language and other languages, including the Afar. Yeah. Number three is a grammar of the Somali language. This is a book published in 1880. It was written by one Captain Frederick Massa Hunter. Now, this guy is the guy who represented the British in the Horn of Africa. He was a political, they used to call him like a political officer or something of sorts. He was the senior most, we could say, British officer who was dealing on behalf of Britain in the Horn of Africa. Most of the treaties that were signed by the Somalis with the British, and also others with the British from the Horn of Africa, usually was the one who was signing on the behalf of the British. Now, he did live not really that much, but To some extent, he lived in the Horn of Africa. He would visit most of the time because he was in charge, we could say, on behalf of the British. And he lived in Berbera and Zeila and would go there to sign treaties, to have conversations with local Somali Commonwealth leaders and things like that. And out of that, of course, he set aside time to try to understand their language, of course, for political reasons, we could say. And the it is really a practical combination of a grammar guide and we could say the first English Somali dictionary. That's what it is. Like, unlike the others that were trying to focus so much into the scholarly understanding of the language, this was like a guide that would help most likely the British who were coming to the Horn of Africa to try to understand the language or to try to do business or political dealings so that they are able to communicate with the people better. So it was more of a guide, a grammar guide, and also English Somali, Somali English dictionary. And we could say this is like the very first English Somali dictionary. It's not very comprehensive, but it served some purpose, we could say. So it matters because it is the first actual standalone printed book on the Somali language. The others were more or less articles that will be published with other publications, but this one was like a book on its own, and it served the British, I guess. The next book, number 4, is Phonology of the Somali Language. Now, this is more academic, we could say. It was written by one Adolf Walter Schlechter. I think he was a German, and he was a scholar of languages. He was a linguist, and he never lived on the lands of the Somalis. Again, he lived in Aden, and I said maybe he found many Somalis in Aden. Aden used to have a huge population of Somalis, and he used to frequent Somali neighborhood in Aden, sometimes staying there, and that's how he came to into contact with language and interrogating the people or interviewing the people, trying to understand their language. Now, this book stands out because he focused so much on the pronunciation and sounds of the language and accents, while the others were focusing on just saying this means this and this, and this is how you use the language. For him, he was like, this is how you pronounce the word. So he focused so much on the pronunciation. Now, this book matters or stands out because it's the first book that focused so much, as I said, on the sound of the language, the phonetics, the sound of the language, how Somali sound, how the Somali language sound, that is. So it was the very first one. But he also included Somali folk tales and oral stories in the book. I think that gave it a little bit more value also. The next book is Somali English Dictionary, Practical Grammar, 1897. This one was published by Father Emile Lerajase and then Father Cyprien de Zamont. These were Catholic priests. And they lived in the lands of the Somalis, actually. They had a mission at Berbera. They had a school at Berbera that they ran for some time. And through teaching Somali children and people, they got to interact with the Somali language. And over time, they accumulated some information. They did some research, and then they of course published a book. This was actually a full-blown dictionary, English to Somali, Somali to English, and you can find a link in the description box that will take you to where you can get a copy of this book. Now, of course, this is a book written over 100 years ago. Somali language most likely has changed. I don't know, but like most languages, like all languages, I guess Somali language has changed a little bit or a lot. But I think it could be an interesting book to read to understand the language use from that period. And this applies to all these books in this list, actually. Now, it stands out, as I said, because it's the first full size dictionary of Somali. It's like the first really a book written to be a dictionary, not just having some dictionary as part of it. It was a pure dictionary written in two sections. One section is Somali to English, the other is English to Somali, arranged in an alphabetical order. It gets to make it useful for somebody who's trying to understand the language. For British or Europeans who wants to understand Somali, it was useful. For Somalis who wanted to understand English, it was useful. That's how useful the book was meant to be, I guess. Number 6 is the Somali language. This one is published between 1900 and 1903. It was written by one Leon Renich. He was an Austrian university professor, and he is called the father of Kushitic studies for his lifelong work on Horn of African languages. So he did a lot of work trying to study the Kushitic languages, and Somali is one of the big Kushitic languages. And he never lived in the lands of the Somalis, so he studied the language from afar. The closest he came to Somalia was Sudan and Egypt, and so but he studied the language from afar, which is a detail that is important, I guess. Now, this book he wrote is in three volume, a collection containing oral poetry, a dictionary, and grammar breakdown. So if you want to read some oral poetry of the Somali, or if you want to get a dictionary, probably English to Somali or Somali to English, and also if you want to understand the grammar structure of the language, those are some of the things he covers in the book. Why it matters, Greenwich proved scientifically that Somali belongs to the Kushitic language. That is his contribution. His major contribution to the language is that he's the one who persuaded all the other scholars that actually the Somali language belongs in the Kushitic language group, alongside others, for example, the Oromo and Afar and those other languages. Number seven, the Grammar of the Somali Language, published 1905, author Major J.W.C. Kirk, who he was a British Army officer. He was serving in the King's African Rifles, which is the army that later on became the Kenya Army, the Uganda Army, Tanzania Army. Yeah, that one. He served there. Yes, he lived in the Somali, and he lived in the interior of the Somali land, with the people trying to understand their language. And during this time, he was part of the army that was fighting Muhammad Abdullah Hassan. So that's how he ended up living in the interior and living with the people and trying to study the language. So it is a field covering, it's a field guide covering grammar, poetry, and regional accent. So he wrote it most likely for the other military officers so that they can use it to understand the basics of the grammar of the language, the poetry, and also how to pronounce words. Now, this book stands out because, unlike the others, Major J.W.C. Kirk really traveled in the interior of the lands of the Somalis. Unlike the others who, for the most part, were studying the language from afar, he lived in the interior, not just the city, but interior. And it also stands out because he also covers the accents of the other people who would be found among the Somalis, the Ibir and the Midgan, the dialects of their languages. He covers that. Now, you can check the description box, the pinned comment, and then you can find links to where you can buy some of these books, or you can get some of these books and try to look through. Maybe they might not be that useful today when it comes to understanding the language, even though they might. I looked at the dictionary, even though I'm not a Somali. It seems like the author did a lot of work, so maybe it's useful. But for scholarly purposes, definitely, if you are somebody who is leaning more towards scholarly understanding of things and you want to understand the Somali language from that perspective, I think these documents are very, 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 very useful. Yeah, so yeah, those are my random thoughts.